The rain had been falling for hours, a steady percussion against the motel window that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own restless heartbeat. I stood in the middle of that cramped room, feeling the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on me like the low ceiling above our heads. The empty beer bottle in my hand felt heavier than it should have, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned it over and over, watching the last drops of amber liquid catch the harsh fluorescent light. 24 hours ago, I had been a different person. 24 hours ago, I could still pretend that the careful distance I had maintained for 2 decades was sustainable, that the promises we had made to each other as frightened boys could hold back the tide of what had always been true between us. But here in this anonymous room off Highway 84, with its faded floral bedspread and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with cigarette smoke from 1,000 previous occupants, those promises felt as fragile as the thin walls that separated us from the rest of the world. Jameson sat on the far bed, his back rigid against the headboard, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that I could see the white of his knuckles even from across the room. He had been sitting like that for the better part of an hour, staring at some fixed point on the carpet between his feet, his jaw working in that way it always did when he was fighting with himself about something he didn't want to acknowledge. His hair, now touched with gray at the temples in a way that made my chest ache with the passage of time, fell across his forehead in the same way it had when we were 17, and everything seemed possible except the one thing we both wanted most. The neon sign from the Shell station across the parking lot cast an intermittent red glow through the thin curtains, painting the room in alternating shades of shadow and artificial light. In those moments of illumination, I could see the tension written across every line of his face, the way his shoulders held themselves as if braced for impact. He looked older than his 38 years, worn down by a life spent running from the truth of himself, and I wondered if I looked the same to him. If the years of careful compartmentalization had etched themselves as visibly into my features. The room itself seemed to absorb our silence. The wood-grain paneling that had probably been installed in the 1970s, and the mirror with its brass frame that reflected our fractured selves back at us in pieces. 2 double beds separated by a nightstand that held a lamp with a shade the color of old parchment, a telephone that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a digital clock whose red numbers seemed to pulse in time with the neon outside. 11:47 p.m. 11:47 p.m. 11:47 p.m. Time moving forward even when everything inside this room felt suspended, caught between past and future in a present that stretched like elastic, ready to snap. I walked to the window, my bare feet silent on the threadbare carpet, and pressed my palm against the cool glass. The parking lot below was nearly empty except for our rental car and a few long-haul trucks whose drivers had pulled off for the night. Beyond that, the darkness stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional sweep of headlights from cars that passed without stopping, carrying their occupants toward destinations that suddenly seemed impossibly distant from this moment, this room, this reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. The beer bottle in my hand caught my reflection in the window, distorting my face into something I didn't recognize. This was what fear looked like, I realized. This was what 20 years of careful self-denial had created. A man standing in a motel room at midnight, holding an empty bottle like it might contain answers, afraid to turn around and face the person who had known him longest and best. The person who had watched him learn to drive and struggle through calculus and pretend to be interested in girls at school dances where they had both moved through the motions of being normal teenagers while their real attention was focused entirely on each other. "You don't have to pretend it didn't happen," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow too loud in the silence that had settled between us like fog. The words felt foreign in my mouth, dangerous in a way that made my pulse quicken and my hands shake even more. For so long, I had been the keeper of what remained unspoken between us, the guardian of the careful boundaries we had established to protect ourselves from the possibility of losing each other entirely. Behind me, I heard the bed creak as he shifted his weight, and I could feel the quality of his attention change, becoming more focused, more acute. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with the electricity that had always existed between us, but which we had learned to ignore so completely that acknowledging it now felt like admitting to some fundamental dishonesty about the shape of our entire adult lives. He shook his head then, a sharp, almost violent motion that sent his hair across his eyes. "You promised," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like he was 17 again and afraid of his own father finding out what we had almost done in the basement of his childhood home. "You said we'd never talk about it. You promised me." I could feel the weight of that promise settling around us like chains. It had been easy to make in the aftermath, when we were both terrified and desperate to return to the safety of what we had always been to each other: best friends, brothers in everything but blood, two halves of the same whole that somehow managed to function in the world as long as we never acknowledged the electricity that crackled in the space between us. But promises made in fear, I was beginning to understand, were different from promises made in love. The memory of that afternoon in his basement rose between us like smoke, even though neither of us had spoken of it directly. We had been 18, home from our first semester of college, sitting on the old couch his parents had banished to the rec room when they bought new furniture for upstairs. We had been talking about nothing important: classes, professors, the strange loneliness of dormitory life, when something in the quality of the light or the way he was looking at me had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. I could still remember the texture of the couch cushions beneath my hands, the way the basement smelled like old carpet and his mother's laundry detergent, the sound of his parents moving around upstairs while we sat in the dim light from the single window, trying to pretend that what was happening between us was something that could be managed through willpower and good intentions. We had leaned toward each other with the inevitability of gravity, and for a moment that lasted forever and no time at all, it had seemed like we might finally stop fighting against what we felt. But then footsteps on the stairs, his father calling down to ask if we wanted sandwiches, and we had sprung apart like we had been caught doing something criminal rather than simply acknowledging what had been true between us since we were old enough to understand what wanting meant. The promise had been made in the aftermath of that interruption, when we were both shaking with adrenaline and terror and the overwhelming relief of having stepped back from a precipice we weren't sure we were ready to cross. Now, 20 years later, that promise felt like a prison we had built around ourselves, walls so high and thick that we had almost forgotten there was a world beyond them. But the weekend we had just shared, the reunion and the road trip, and all the small moments of recognition that had accumulated like evidence in a case neither of us wanted to prosecute, had shown us cracks in those walls, places where the light could get in and illuminate what we had been keeping in darkness. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the window with increased urgency, and I watched my reflection waver in the glass like a ghost of myself. Behind me, I could hear the soft sound of Jameson's breathing, irregular and careful, as if he were trying to measure each inhale and exhale to keep himself from falling apart. I knew that rhythm, had memorized it during countless nights when we had shared sleeping bags on camping trips or fallen asleep on opposite ends of his childhood couch during movie marathons that lasted until dawn. There had been so many moments over the years when I had wanted to say something, to break the careful silence we had constructed around what we felt. During his wedding to Vanessa, when I had stood in the back of the church and watched him promise to love and honor a woman who was beautiful and kind and everything a man was supposed to want, while I felt like I was attending a funeral for something that had never been allowed to live. During the birth of his children, when he had called me from the hospital with exhaustion and joy in his voice, and I had congratulated him while trying to ignore the way my heart broke a little more each time he achieved another milestone of the normal life he was building. During my own wedding to Elaine, when I had looked out at the small gathering of family and friends and seen him sitting in the third row, his face carefully composed into an expression of appropriate happiness, while his eyes held something that looked like grief. We had both been so committed to the fiction that we could love other people with the same intensity we felt for each other, that we could build authentic lives on the foundation of what we were pretending not to feel. I never promised not to feel it. I whispered to the window, to the rain, to the 20 years of silence that had brought us to this moment. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession, and I felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of what we had built together. I had spent so long being careful, so long protecting him from the weight of my wanting, that I had almost convinced myself it was a kindness. But standing there in that anonymous room with the rain washing the world clean outside, I realized that my silence had been as much about protecting myself as it had been about protecting him. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had preceded it, heavier and more charged, as if the very molecules in the air had been rearranged by my words. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, the whisper of fabric as Jameson moved on the bed behind me, the distant hum of the ice machine down the hall that seemed to vibrate through the thin walls like a mechanical prayer. When I finally turned around, he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something raw and unguarded that reminded me of the boy he had been before we learned to be afraid of ourselves. His hands were no longer clasped in his lap, but were gripping the edge of the mattress as if he needed something to anchor him to the physical world while everything else shifted and realigned around us. When I turned around, he was looking at me finally, his eyes wide and dark in the intermittent neon light. There was something raw in his expression, something that reminded me of the boy he had been before the world taught him to be afraid of what he felt. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the space of that small room, and I could feel the weight of everything we had never said pressing against the thin membrane of our carefully maintained friendship. His mouth opened as if he were going to speak, then closed again, and I watched him struggle with words that seemed too large for the space between us. The red glow from the neon sign pulsed across his face like a heartbeat, and in those moments of illumination I could see the fear there, but also something else, something that looked like recognition, like relief, like the first breath of someone who had been holding it for too long. "What are you saying?" he asked, and his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him over the sound of the rain. But we both knew what I was saying, had probably both known for 20 years what this conversation would sound like if we ever allowed ourselves to have it. The motel room seemed to shrink around us, the walls drawing closer with each heartbeat, and I understood with sudden clarity that we had reached the edge of something that could not be uncrossed. All those years of careful navigation, of measured distance and practiced normalcy, had led us to this moment where the truth of what we were to each other could no longer be contained by the promises we had made as boys who were too afraid to want what they wanted. I could feel the weight of the beer bottle in my hand, warm now from my grip, and I set it down on the windowsill with a small clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged air between us. The gesture felt symbolic somehow, like I was putting down more than just glass and aluminum, like I was finally setting aside the careful props I had used to construct a performance of normalcy that had lasted most of my adult life. The room held its breath around us, the only sound the steady percussion of rain against glass and the occasional rumble of a truck passing on the highway outside. Even the neon sign seemed to have stilled its restless flickering, as if the entire world was waiting to see what we would do with this moment we had finally stumbled into despite our best efforts to avoid it. Outside, a truck pulled into the parking lot, its diesel engine rumbling to a stop before falling silent. The driver's footsteps echoed across the wet asphalt, fading as he made his way to his own anonymous room, his own temporary refuge from whatever journey had brought him here. And in that silence that followed, I could hear the sound of everything changing, the almost imperceptible shift that occurs when the life you have been living gives way to the life you might still choose to live. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked over to 11:48, and I realized that time was still moving even though everything in this room felt suspended in amber, preserved in a moment that contained all the weight of what we had been to each other and all the possibility of what we might become. The red numbers seemed to pulse with their own urgency, reminding us that even revelations had to exist within the practical constraints of time and space and morning checkout requirements. I could see myself reflected in the window behind me, a ghostly overlay on the darkness outside, and for a moment I looked like someone I didn't recognize, older, wearier, but also somehow more present than I had been in years. This was what honesty looked like, I realized. This was what it meant to stop hiding from yourself, to finally acknowledge the shape of your own desire without apology or explanation. The neon sign flickered once, twice, then went dark, plunging us into the kind of darkness that makes honesty easier and regret more immediate. In that moment, before either of us could speak again, before we could retreat behind the familiar walls of our friendship or advance into the unknown territory of what we might become, I felt the weight of the next words I would speak gathering in my chest like a storm that had been building for 20 years. 20 years of wanting him. 20 years of loving him in the careful, contained way that allowed us both to sleep at night. 20 years of measuring the distance between us and finding it both too much and never enough. In the darkness, I could hear him breathing, could sense the tension in his body, even though I could no longer see his face clearly. The air between us felt electric, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure, and I understood that whatever happened next would determine not just the shape of this night, but the architecture of whatever remained of our lives. The story of how we had arrived in that room, of the reunion invitation and the road trip, and all the small moments of recognition that had led us back to each other, seemed suddenly less important than this moment of suspension, this breath between what had been and what might be. And as I stood there in the darkness, listening to the rain and his breathing and the sound of my own heart learning a new rhythm, I understood that some stories begin not with action, but with the moment when two people finally stop running from what they have always known to be true. But even understanding that, even feeling the weight of 20 years of careful silence pressing against the walls of this small room, I also knew that some truths, once spoken, could not be taken back. Some doors, once opened, changed the shape of everything that came after. And standing there in the darkness with the rain washing the world clean outside and the sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears, I had to decide whether I was finally brave enough to reach for the handle. 20 years before that motel room, before the rain and the reckoning and the words that would change everything, I had built myself a life that looked, from the outside, like contentment. It was a careful construction, assembled piece by piece with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that visibility could be dangerous and that the safest way to live was to become so thoroughly ordinary that no one would think to look too closely. Portland had chosen me as much as I had chosen it. After college, after the brief, disastrous attempt at graduate school that had ended when I realized I was using literature as a hiding place rather than a calling, I had drifted west with the kind of aimless determination that characterizes people who are running from something they cannot name. The city welcomed me with its gray skies and coffee shops, its culture of polite distance and carefully cultivated eccentricity that made my own particular brand of solitude seem less like a defect and more like a lifestyle choice. The drive from Colorado to Oregon had taken me 3 days, my car loaded with books and the few possessions that had seemed worth transporting across state lines. I had stopped at truck stops and roadside diners where no one knew my name or my history, where I could sit in vinyl booths and drink coffee that tasted like anonymity while watching the landscape change from mountains to desert to the green abundance of the Pacific Northwest. Each mile had felt like a small death, a shedding of some version of myself that I was no longer willing to carry. I found work teaching high school English at Roosevelt, a sprawling brick building on the north side that housed 1,500 teenagers and their accumulated dreams and disappointments. The job suited me in ways I had not expected. There was something about standing in front of a classroom full of 17-year-olds, watching them discover that Gatsby's green light was more than just a navigation aid, that allowed me to feel useful without feeling exposed. I could guide them toward understanding without having to reveal too much of my own inner landscape, could teach them about love and loss and the complex mathematics of human desire while keeping my own calculations carefully hidden. My students liked me, I think, though they might have struggled to articulate why. I was not the teacher who tried to be their friend, nor the one who ruled through fear or intimidation. Instead, I inhabited a middle space that felt natural to me, offering them respect and genuine interest while maintaining the boundaries that allowed us all to feel safe. They called me Mr. Reed and brought me their essays about first heartbreak and family dysfunction and the terrible clarity that comes with being almost but not quite adult. In their writing, I saw versions of myself at their age, all that raw need for connection wrapped in carefully constructed defenses. There was Sarah, a junior who wrote poetry about her parents' divorce with a precision that would have made professional writers envious, and Marcus, a senior who understood Holden Caulfield's anger in ways that worried me enough to suggest he talk to the school counselor. There was Elena, whose essays about her grandmother's immigration story revealed a depth of empathy that gave me hope for the future, and David, who could analyze the symbolism in Beloved with the kind of insight that reminded me why I had fallen in love with literature in the first place. These were the relationships that sustained me. These careful connections with young people who were just beginning to understand that the world was more complicated than they had been led to believe. I could give them something valuable, the tools to think critically about what they read and experienced, without having to reveal the various ways that my own critical thinking had failed me when it came to the practical business of living authentically. The house I bought in Southeast Portland was a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and built-in bookcases that had probably been installed by someone who understood that books were not just objects but companions. It was small enough that I could maintain it alone, large enough that I did not feel cramped by my own presence. I painted the walls a warm gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that suited my temperament. The previous owners had left behind a garden that I tended with the same careful attention I brought to everything else in my life, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the Pacific Northwest soil with a patience I had learned to apply to most situations requiring growth. The garden became my meditation, my form of prayer. Spring meant preparing the soil and planting seeds with the kind of faith that required believing in futures you could not see. Summer meant watering and weeding and the daily miracle of watching things grow according to their own internal logic. Fall meant harvest and preservation, the satisfaction of filling jars with jam and pickles and tomato sauce that would sustain me through the darker months. Winter meant planning and dreaming and studying seed catalogs like they contained the blueprints for redemption. My routines became my religion. Morning coffee made in the French press that had been a wedding gift, though Elaine and I had used it perhaps a dozen times in 6 years of marriage. The ritual of grinding the beans, heating the water to exactly the right temperature, timing the bloom and the pour. These small acts of precision created a framework for the day that felt both necessary and sacred. Breakfast eaten standing at the kitchen counter while I graded papers or planned lessons, the morning light filtering through the window above the sink and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny prayers. The drive to school through neighborhoods that changed with the seasons, but never in ways that surprised me, became a form of moving meditation. I learned the rhythms of the city, the way traffic flowed differently on Mondays than on Fridays, the way certain intersections became impassable when it rained, the way the homeless encampments shifted and evolved according to city policies and weather patterns that I could track through observation but never fully understand. Lunch eaten alone in my classroom became a sanctuary within the larger sanctuary of my carefully constructed solitude. While other teachers gathered in the faculty room to complain about administration and students and the various indignities of public education, I would eat my sandwich and read whatever novel I was teaching, or work my way through the classics I had somehow missed during my own education. Crime and Punishment, 100 Years of Solitude, Beloved, books that required the kind of sustained attention that was difficult to find outside of those quiet moments when the hallways were empty and I could lose myself in other people's carefully constructed worlds. Evenings were for preparation and solitude in equal measure. Dinner was often something simple, pasta with whatever vegetables were ready in the garden, eaten while listening to NPR or the kind of jazz that sounded like rain against windows. The news provided connection to a larger world while maintaining enough distance to avoid feeling overwhelmed by problems I could not solve. The jazz created atmosphere without demanding attention, background music for the business of living alone. I graded papers at the kitchen table until the light faded. reading student essays about Romeo and Juliet, and trying to help 17-year-olds understand that love and obsession were different things, that the tragedy of Shakespeare's lovers was not that they died for love, but that they confused intensity with depth. The irony of this particular lesson was not lost on me, though I filed it away with all the other small hypocrisies that characterized the gap between what I taught and what I practiced. When the papers were graded and the lessons planned, I moved to the living room where I would read until my eyes grew heavy. Fiction mostly, novels by writers who understood that the most important stories were often the ones that could not be told directly, who knew how to say everything by saying almost nothing, who could capture the weight of unspoken longing in the space between words. Fridays, I allowed myself the luxury of the independent theater downtown, where I could lose myself in foreign films with subtitles that required attention, stories from places where the rules of engagement between people seemed slightly different from the ones I had learned. French films about middle-aged affairs conducted with the kind of sophisticated melancholy that made adultery look like art. Italian films about families whose dysfunction was so beautifully rendered that you almost envied their ability to hurt each other with such passion. Japanese films about solitude and loss and the small gestures that constituted love when love was not permitted to speak its name. I would sit in the darkened theater surrounded by other solitary souls and lose myself in lives that were more dramatic than mine, but not necessarily more authentic. The ritual of driving downtown, buying a ticket, sitting in the dark while strangers' stories played out on screen, it became my form of church, a place where I could contemplate the various ways that people struggled to connect with each other without having to risk any actual connection myself. The marriage to Elaine had been, I understood in retrospect, an act of profound kindness on both our parts. We had met at a faculty mixer during my third year of teaching, when the principal was still making gentle suggestions about my need to socialize more with my colleagues. She taught fifth grade at an elementary school across town, and we had discovered a shared love of books and long walks and the kind of conversation that meandered through topics without urgency. She was pretty in an understated way, with dark hair that she wore pulled back and eyes that seemed to hold some gentle sadness that matched my own. Our first conversation had lasted 3 hours, conducted in the corner of the school cafeteria where the mixer was being held, both of us nursing glasses of cheap white wine while discussing the challenges of teaching literature to students who had been raised on social media and instant gratification. She had laughed at my jokes in a way that suggested she understood their underlying melancholy, and I had found myself telling her things about my teaching philosophy that I had never articulated to anyone else. Our courtship had been comfortable rather than passionate, built on genuine affection and the relief that comes from finding someone who does not demand more than you are prepared to give. We went to movies and concerts, shared dinners at restaurants where we could talk without having to shout over music designed for younger, more enthusiastic patrons. She introduced me to her friends, all of them elementary school teachers or social workers or librarians who seemed to exist in the same carefully modulated emotional register that characterized our relationship. When I proposed, it was with a ring I had chosen carefully, but without the kind of desperate longing that seemed to characterize other couples we knew. I had taken her to the Japanese garden, where we had spent many Saturday afternoons walking among the carefully tended landscapes that represented idealized nature, and I had asked her to marry me beside a pond that reflected the sky, so perfectly it was impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. She said yes with a smile that suggested she was as surprised as I was, and we planned a small wedding that satisfied our family's need for tradition without requiring us to pretend to emotions we did not entirely feel. The wedding itself had been a study in careful orchestration, designed to create the appearance of joy without requiring anyone to feel anything too intensely. Her family was kind but distant, farmers from eastern Oregon who seemed to regard me as a somewhat exotic creature but approved of my steady employment and apparent stability. My parents, already beginning the slow decline that would eventually require them to move to assisted living, were simply grateful that I was marrying someone who seemed likely to make me happy, or at least not obviously miserable. The marriage lasted 6 years, And if I am honest, those were not unhappy years. We shared a larger apartment, and then the house developed routines that accommodated both our needs for solitude and companionship. She read novels in bed while I graded papers at the kitchen table. We took turns cooking and doing dishes, maintained a garden together, hosted dinner parties for other couples who seemed to be playing similar roles in the complicated theater of adult life. We had sex regularly, but without the kind of urgency that suggests desperation or discovery. And if she noticed that my attention sometimes seemed to drift during those moments of intended intimacy, she was kind enough not to mention it. There had been moments during the marriage when I almost told her the truth about myself, times when the weight of what I was not saying felt heavier than what I was carrying alone deserved. Late at night, lying in bed while she slept beside me, I would compose speeches in my head about the nature of desire and identity and the various ways that people could love each other without being able to give each other what they needed most. But the words never made it from my consciousness to my mouth, and eventually I stopped composing them entirely. The end came not with drama or revelation, but with a conversation that lasted most of a Sunday afternoon in late fall. We were raking leaves in the backyard, working in the companionable silence that had become our default mode of communication, when she stopped and leaned on her rake and said that she thought we might both be happier if we stopped pretending that what we had was what either of us had wanted when we imagined our lives as adults. The conversation that followed was conducted with the same careful politeness that had characterized most of our important discussions, both of us working to avoid saying anything that might hurt the other person unnecessarily. She spoke about feeling like she was living slightly to the left of her own life, about watching herself go through motions that looked right from the outside but felt hollow at the center. I found myself agreeing with her assessment while simultaneously feeling something like relief that she had been the one to name what we had both been feeling. She was not unkind about it. She did not accuse me of deception or withholding, did not suggest that I had failed her in any specific way. Instead, she talked about the feeling of living slightly to the left of her own life, of watching herself go through motions that looked right from the outside but felt hollow at the center. When I asked if there was someone else, she shook her head and said she thought the problem was that there was no one else for either of us, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that would require us to become more than we had been willing to be. The divorce was as quiet as the marriage had been. We divided our possessions with the same careful consideration we had brought to most decisions, taking turns choosing books and kitchen items and pieces of furniture that had accumulated during our time together. She moved to a smaller apartment closer to her school, and I kept the house and the garden and the routines that had served me well before she had arrived and would serve me well after she left. We remained cordial in the way that two people can when they recognize that they have not hurt each other intentionally, have simply discovered that they were not quite the right shape to fit together permanently. We exchanged holiday cards for the first year after the divorce, brief updates on our professional lives and health that maintained the illusion of ongoing connection without requiring actual intimacy. But even that gentle correspondence had faded, and now it had been more than 2 years since we had spoken. I thought of her sometimes when I was working in the garden we had planned together, wondered if she had found whatever it was she had been looking for when she decided that what we had was not enough. My colleagues at school treated my return to bachelorhood with the kind of careful sympathy that suggested they understood I had suffered a loss, even if the nature of that loss was not entirely clear to any of us. The other English teachers invited me to join them for drinks after work more frequently, and I accepted these invitations often enough to demonstrate that I was not withdrawing from human contact entirely, but not so often that anyone would mistake me for someone who was actively seeking new connections. I helped Mrs. Chun, my elderly neighbor, with her groceries and the maintenance tasks that had become difficult for her since her husband's death. She rewarded this assistance with containers of soup and the kind of conversation that required little emotional investment but provided genuine human warmth. She asked occasionally if I was dating anyone, and I developed a repertoire of gentle deflections that satisfied her curiosity without encouraging further inquiry. Mrs. Chun had become something like family to me, the closest thing I had to a regular human connection that existed outside of my professional obligations. She was in her late 70s, a retired librarian who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, and who served as an unofficial keeper of its history and gossip. Her house was a mirror image of mine, the same 1920s craftsman design, but filled with the accumulated evidence of a life shared with another person, photographs and mementos and furniture that had been chosen by two people who planned to grow old together. Her husband had died 3 years before I moved to the neighborhood, and she had been slowly learning to navigate widowhood with the kind of practical grace that seemed to characterize her approach to most challenges. She maintained her garden with the same precision she had brought to organizing library collections, and she baked bread on Sundays with a regularity that suggested it was as much ritual as sustenance. The years accumulated quietly. Students graduated and were replaced by new students who brought their own versions of familiar struggles. I refinished the hardwood floors, replaced the roof, painted the exterior of the house a color that the neighbors assured me was both attractive and appropriate for the neighborhood. I read novels and graded essays and attended faculty meetings where we discussed budget cuts and testing requirements and the various challenges facing public education. It was a life built not on lies, exactly, but on omissions so carefully maintained that they had become a kind of truth. I was a good teacher, a reliable colleague, a helpful neighbor, a man who had been married briefly and now lived alone by choice. These facts formed a narrative that satisfied the curiosity of anyone who needed to know who I was, and I had learned to inhabit that narrative so completely that there were days when I almost forgot what I was not saying. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in late October, mixed in with bills and catalogs and the other debris of adult life that accumulated in the mailbox with depressing regularity. The envelope was thick cream paper with my name and address written in what was obviously a computer's approximation of script handwriting. I almost discarded it without opening, assuming it was some kind of marketing disguised as personal correspondence, but something about the return address made me pause. Roosevelt High School Class of 2005 Reunion Committee. The words seemed to shimmer on the paper like a mirage, and for a moment I could not quite process their meaning. It had been 20 years since graduation, which meant I was old enough to be curious about whatever had become of the people I had known when we all believed our lives were just beginning. But the school was in Colorado, in the small mountain town where I had grown up and which I had not visited since Danny's funeral 8 years earlier. Danny Morrison, the third point in the triangle that had defined my adolescence, the friend who had made everything possible between Jameson and me by providing cover for an intimacy that might otherwise have seemed suspicious to the adults who were watching us navigate the treacherous waters of teenage sexuality. Danny had been the extrovert to our introversion, the one who pushed us to try things we were too cautious to attempt on our own, who had talked us into camping trips and road trips and various adventures that had provided the context for whatever it was that Jameson and I had been to each other. His death had been the kind of accident that seemed impossible until it happened, a car sliding off an icy mountain road during his sophomore year of college, too sudden and too final for any of us to process the loss with anything resembling grace. I had flown back to Colorado for the funeral, had stood in the same church where we had all been confirmed, and watched his parents try to make sense of a world that would continue to exist without their only child. Jameson had been there too, of course, and we had sat in the same pew and shared the same overwhelming sense of displacement. The recognition that losing Danny meant losing the context that had allowed us to remain close without having to name what we were to each other. The funeral had been the last time we had been in the same place for any extended period, and I realized now that Danny's death had marked the beginning of the end of whatever it was that Jameson and I had been trying to preserve. I opened the envelope standing at the kitchen counter, still wearing the jacket I had worn to school that day, and read the cheerful invitation with its promises of renewed friendships and shared memories and the opportunity to reconnect with the people who had known me when I was becoming whoever I was supposed to be. There would be a dinner on Saturday night at the hotel downtown, followed by a more casual gathering on Sunday afternoon at the lake, where we had all spent so many summer days pretending to be older than we were. As I read, I felt something shift in the careful architecture of my contentment, a trembling in the foundation that I had spent so many years constructing. The invitation was not just asking me to return to a place I had left behind. It was asking me to return to a version of myself that I had worked very hard to outgrow. More than that, it was asking me to confront the possibility of seeing Jameson again, and the thought of that confrontation filled me with a mixture of longing and terror that I had not felt in years. Jameson Pierce. Even thinking his name felt dangerous, like speaking an incantation that might summon something I was not prepared to handle. We had been inseparable once, the kind of friends that other people assumed were brothers, finishing each other's sentences and sharing secrets and dreams with the kind of trust that only exists before the world teaches you to be careful about who you let inside your defenses. But we had not spoken in more than a year, not since the careful friendship we had maintained through college and early adulthood had finally succumbed to the weight of what we could not say to each other. The silence between us had not been dramatic, had not involved accusations or betrayals or any of the obvious catalysts that end relationships. Instead, it had been the kind of gradual fading that happens when two people realize they can no longer navigate the distance between what they are to each other and what they might want to be. The last conversation we had shared had been about nothing important: his work, my teaching, the weather in our respective cities. But underneath the surface pleasantries there had been a quality of strain that suggested we were both working too hard to maintain something that was no longer sustainable. We had both understood, without saying so directly, that continuing to talk would eventually require us to address what we were not talking about, and neither of us had been ready for that conversation. I folded the invitation carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter, then stood looking at it for a long time as the light faded outside and the house settled into its evening rhythms around me. The familiar sounds of my solitary life, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the mantel, the whisper of wind through the trees outside, seemed suddenly inadequate to contain the magnitude of what this simple piece of paper was asking of me. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether the life I had built was strong enough to withstand the earthquake of returning to the place where it had all begun, or whether some foundations, no matter how carefully constructed, were never meant to bear the weight of the truth. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter like a challenge, daring me to be braver than I had been for the past 20 years, asking me to risk the careful peace I had constructed for the possibility of something more authentic, more dangerous, more real. I had decided not to go. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, gathering the kind of domestic dust that accumulates on things we know we should deal with, but cannot quite bring ourselves to touch. Each morning, I would see it while making coffee, and each evening, I would notice it again while preparing dinner, but I had convinced myself that the decision had already been made through inaction. 20 years was long enough to let the past remain where it belonged, and I had built a life that functioned precisely because it did not require me to excavate the complicated archaeology of who I had been when I was 17 and thought I knew what I wanted. But on Thursday evening, as I was grading a stack of essays about the Great Gatsby and thinking about how many ways there were to misunderstand the nature of longing, my phone rang with a number I recognized even though it had been more than a year since I had seen it on my screen. I stared at the display for 3 rings, watching Jameson's name pulse in blue letters, before I finally answered with a hello that sounded steadier than I felt. His voice was older, deeper than I remembered, carrying the kind of weariness that accumulates in the spaces between the words we actually say. He said my name like he was testing it, like he was not entirely sure I would still recognize him after all this time, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized I had been holding tight. I got the invite, he said without preamble, and I could hear traffic in the background, the sound of him walking somewhere while talking, probably pacing the way he always did when he was working through something complicated. You going? The question hung between us, carrying weight that had nothing to do with high school reunions or nostalgic returns to the places we had grown up. I could have said no, should have said no, could have told him that I had commitments here, papers to grade, a life that did not accommodate the kind of disruption that seeing him again would inevitably create. Instead, I found myself asking where he was calling from, and when he said Denver, I realized that the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought. We talked for 47 minutes that first night, longer than we had talked in years, our conversation meandering through the safe territories of work and weather and the mutual acquaintances whose lives we knew only through social media updates and Christmas cards. He was working construction now, he told me, after the marketing job had ended during the recession, and he had discovered that he preferred working with his hands to sitting in meetings where people talked about engagement metrics and brand synergy. His voice, when he described the work, carried a satisfaction that I did not remember from our earlier conversations about careers and futures and the ways we had imagined our adult lives would unfold. When I asked about Vanessa, his ex-wife, there was a pause long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then he said that the divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, that it had been a long time coming, that they had probably both known it was ending before either of them had been willing to admit it. He mentioned 2 children, Emma and Jake, 8 and 10, who lived with their mother in a suburb outside Denver, and whom he saw every other weekend and one evening a week for dinner that usually involved hamburgers and careful conversation about school and friends and anything that did not require them to navigate the complicated emotional landscape of a family that had been reorganized against everyone's preferences. I told him about the end of my marriage to Elaine, about the quiet dissolution that had left both of us sadder but not necessarily sorrier, and he listened without offering the kind of easy consolation that people usually provided when discussing divorce. Instead, he said that some relationships were like houses built on foundations that looked solid until you realized they were not quite deep enough to support the weight of everything you were trying to construct on top of them. By the time we hung up, we had agreed to drive to Colorado together, a road trip that would take us through Oregon and Idaho and Utah before arriving in the small mountain town where we had both learned to drive and had our first jobs and believed that the future was something that happened to other people. 2 days on the road, he said, like old times, and I agreed, even though I knew that nothing about this journey would be like the trips we had taken as teenagers, when the distance between us had been measured in miles rather than years of careful silence. The reunion was still 2 weeks away, which gave me time to arrange for substitute teachers and to prepare myself for whatever this return might require. I found myself paying attention to details I had not considered in years, replacing the worn t-shirts I usually wore on weekends, getting my hair cut shorter than I typically preferred, as if returning to the place where I had grown up required a version of myself that was more presentable than the one I had become comfortable being. Jameson picked me up on a Friday morning in early November, driving a blue Ford pickup that looked like it had been chosen for function rather than aesthetics. He was standing beside the truck when I came out of the house with my overnight bag, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the distance of my front walk, 2 men in their late 30s trying to reconcile the people we had become with the boys we remembered being to each other. He looked older, inevitably, but the changes were subtle rather than dramatic. His hair was shorter than he had worn it in high school, and there were lines around his eyes that suggested he had spent significant time squinting into sunlight or concentrating on work that required precision. His hands, when he reached for my bag, were calloused in a way they had not been when we were younger, marked by the kind of physical labor that leaves permanent evidence on the body. But his smile was the same crooked grin I remembered, and when he said it was good to see me, I believed him. The first few hours of driving were filled with the careful navigation that characterizes renewed friendships, conversation that touched on safe subjects, while both of us learned again how to read the subtle signals that had once been as familiar as our own heartbeats. We talked about the route we would take, about the weather forecast for the mountains, about the logistics of hotel rooms and dinner reservations, and all the practical details that allowed us to avoid discussing why we were really making this trip together. But as the miles accumulated and the landscape outside the windows shifted from the green familiarity of the Pacific Northwest to the broader, more austere beauty of the high desert, our conversation began to find its old rhythm. He told me about the house he was renting in a neighborhood that was slowly being gentrified around him, about the satisfaction he found in framing walls and installing plumbing and creating spaces where people would build their lives. I talked about my students, about the particular challenges of teaching literature to teenagers who had been raised on social media and instant gratification, about the moments when a 17-year-old would suddenly understand why Holden Caulfield was so angry and I would remember why I had chosen this profession. We stopped for lunch at a diner in Baker City, Oregon, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the pie was homemade, and the waitress called everyone honey regardless of age or gender. Sitting across from each other in a red vinyl booth, I found myself studying the details of how he had aged, the way his hands moved when he talked, the slight hesitation he had developed before laughing, as if he were checking to make sure the humor was appropriate before allowing himself to enjoy it. He caught me watching him at one point and raised an eyebrow in a gesture so familiar that I felt something like grief for all the years we had not been doing this, had not been sitting across from each other and sharing stories and existing in the easy intimacy that had once defined our friendship. "You're cataloging the damage," he said with that crooked smile, and I realized that he was doing the same thing, noting the ways that time and experience had marked me, comparing the person sitting across from him with the boy he had known when we both believed that the future was something we could control through careful planning and good intentions. The afternoon passed in a landscape of increasing grandeur, the flat agricultural valleys giving way to foothills, and then to mountains that rose around us like the walls of some vast cathedral. We talked about college, about the different paths we had taken after graduation when the certainty of our friendship had been tested by distance and new relationships, and the gradual realization that becoming adults required us to make choices about who we wanted to be that had not seemed necessary when we were 17. He had gone to Colorado State for engineering, he reminded me, though he had changed majors twice before settling on business, a decision that had satisfied his parents without entirely satisfying him. I had chosen a small liberal arts college in California, drawn by the promise of professors who would treat literature as something sacred rather than merely academic, though I had discovered that the reality of studying what you loved was more complicated than the romance of it had suggested. We had stayed in touch during those first years, calling each other late at night when the loneliness of dormitory life became too acute, writing emails that grew longer and more infrequent as we each found our footing in our new lives. But there had been a gradual cooling, a slow recognition that the easy intimacy we had shared as teenagers was more difficult to maintain when we were surrounded by new people who knew us only as we were becoming, not as we had been. By the time the sun began to set behind the mountains ahead of us, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too dramatic to be real, we had fallen into a comfortable silence that felt more like companionship than awkwardness. The radio played quietly, classic rock from the 70s and 80s that served as soundtrack to the landscape rolling past outside our windows, and I found myself relaxing in a way that I had not experienced in months, possibly years. We stopped for the night at a rest area outside Twin Falls, Idaho, a place where long-haul truckers and families on vacation pulled off the interstate to stretch their legs and use facilities that were clean enough to be functional and basic enough to remind you that you were just passing through. Jameson parked the truck beneath one of the security lights that illuminated the parking area in harsh white circles, and we walked to the picnic tables that sat on a small rise overlooking the Snake River Canyon. The night was clear and cold, the kind of high desert evening where the stars appeared with startling clarity, as if someone had adjusted the contrast on the sky to reveal details that were usually hidden. We had bought beer at the last gas station, and we sat on opposite sides of a picnic table drinking from bottles that grew cold in our hands while we looked up at constellations that neither of us could identify with confidence. The conversation turned to Danny almost inevitably, the third point in the triangle that our friendship had formed during high school. Danny Morrison, who had been the extrovert to our introversion, the one who pushed us to try things we were too cautious to attempt on our own, who had died in a car accident during our sophomore year of college, too young and too suddenly for any of us to process the loss with anything resembling grace. Jameson said he still thought about him sometimes, wondered what Danny would have done with his life if he had been given the chance to live it, whether he would have stayed in Colorado or moved away, whether he would have married the girl he had been dating or discovered that high school relationships were not built to survive the transition to adulthood. I admitted that I sometimes found myself having conversations with Danny in my head, usually when I was facing some decision that seemed too important to make alone, and that I had never been able to decide whether this was a healthy way of processing grief or a sign that I had never learned to rely entirely on my own judgment. The conversation drifted from Danny to loneliness, to the particular isolation that seemed to characterize adult life even when you were surrounded by people who cared about you. Jameson talked about the evenings when his children were with their mother, and he would sit in his house listening to the sounds of other families through the walls, the television programs and dinner preparations and bedtime routines that reminded him that life was happening all around him even when he felt disconnected from it. I described the sensation of standing in front of a classroom full of teenagers who looked to me for guidance about literature and life, while I felt like I was still figuring out the answers to the same questions they were asking. We talked about the marriages that had ended not with drama, but with the quiet recognition that we had been trying to be people we were not quite capable of being, and the way that failure could feel like relief even when it also felt like loss. The night grew colder, and we moved closer together on the picnic table bench, not quite touching but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The beer and the darkness and the strange intimacy of being alone together in a place where no one knew us created a bubble of honesty that felt both dangerous and necessary. It was then that he said it, the words that would lodge themselves in my memory and replay during the long hours of driving that still lay ahead of us. Just don't try anything, all right? He said it with a laugh, but there was something underneath the humor, a tension that suggested he was warning himself as much as he was warning me. I don't want this to get weird. I did not respond immediately, could not trust my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. Instead, I took a long drink from my beer and looked up at the stars and felt something fundamental shift in the air between us, some acknowledgement of what we had spent 20 years not saying to each other. When I finally looked at him, he was studying my face in the harsh light from the security lamps, and I could see that he knew exactly what he had revealed with those words, what he had acknowledged about the nature of whatever this was that still existed between us after all these years of careful distance. We finished our beers in a silence that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, then walked back to the truck where we would drive through the night toward whatever awaited us in the small mountain town where we had learned to be afraid of wanting what we wanted. But something had changed in those moments at the picnic table, some recognition that the careful boundaries we had maintained for so long were not as solid as we had convinced ourselves they were. The road stretched ahead of us, dark and full of promise and threat, and I understood that we were driving toward more than just a high school reunion. We were driving toward a reckoning with the boys we had been and the men we had become, and the space between them where the truth of what we meant to each other had been waiting, patient and persistent, for us to be brave enough to acknowledge it. The road between Twin Falls and our destination became a thread connecting past and present, each mile marker a small countdown to a reckoning I was no longer sure I wanted to avoid. We drove through landscapes that seemed designed to make a person feel both insignificant and eternal, vast stretches of high desert punctuated by small towns that existed like islands of human determination in an ocean of sagebrush and sky. The silence between us had evolved during the night, transforming from the careful politeness of renewed acquaintance into something denser, more charged with possibility and unspoken recognition. Jameson drove with the concentration of someone who understood that the act of navigation was about more than simply getting from one place to another. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, calloused from years of construction work, and I found myself watching them more often than I should have, noting the way his fingers curved around the wheel, the small scar on his left thumb that I remembered from a woodworking accident in high school shop class. When he caught me looking, there was a moment of eye contact that lasted a fraction of a second longer than necessary, long enough for both of us to register what was happening, but not long enough for either of us to have to acknowledge it directly. We stopped for breakfast in a town called Tremonton, Utah, population 4,000 and change according to the sign that welcomed visitors to what it proudly declared was the home of the 1998 state championship wrestling team. The diner we chose could have been transplanted from 1975 without anyone noticing. All red vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that came in heavy white mugs that had seen better decades. The waitress was perhaps 60, with graying hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had given up caring what anyone thought about her appearance sometime around the Carter administration, and she poured our coffee without being asked and called us honey in a way that managed to be both maternal and slightly flirtatious. We ordered eggs and bacon and hash browns, food that would have horrified the health-conscious teachers I ate lunch with in Portland, but somehow seemed appropriate for this journey into a past where calories had not yet become moral categories. While we waited for our food, Jameson pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of his children, Emma and Jake, two kids who had inherited his dark hair and their mother's more delicate features. In the photos, they were building something elaborate with blocks, their faces serious with concentration, and I could see echoes of the boy Jameson had been when he was their age, the same intensity he brought to any project that captured his attention. He talked about them with the careful tenderness that characterizes divorced parents, describing Emma's passion for soccer and Jake's obsession with drawing elaborate maps of imaginary countries, complete with political systems and trade agreements that suggested a future in either urban planning or world domination. When he mentioned the difficulty of maintaining connection across the distance imposed by custody arrangements, his voice carried a sadness that was too deep to be entirely about logistics. I found myself thinking about the children I had never had, the conversations about starting a family that Elaine and I had engaged in with decreasing frequency as our marriage progressed, until we both understood that we were talking around something neither of us was willing to name directly. She had wanted children, I thought, though she had never pushed the issue beyond gentle suggestions about visiting friends who had recently become parents, observations about how happy couples looked when they were pushing strollers through the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. The truth, which I had never spoken aloud to anyone, was that the idea of being responsible for shaping another human being terrified me in ways that had nothing to do with finances or career timing or any of the practical concerns that people usually cited when explaining why they were waiting to have children. How could I guide a child toward authentic selfhood when I was still learning to inhabit my own life with honesty? How could I teach someone about love when I had spent decades avoiding the most fundamental truths about my own capacity for it? But watching Jameson talk about Emma and Jake, seeing the way his entire demeanor softened when he described their personalities and achievements and the particular challenges they were navigating as they grew from children into the people they would eventually become, I felt something that might have been envy. Not for the complications of divorce and custody arrangements, but for the evidence that he had been brave enough to try, had allowed himself to love people who would require him to be better than he might naturally be inclined to be. After breakfast, we drove deeper into Utah, through landscape that seemed designed by someone with a dramatic sensibility and unlimited resources. The mountains rose around us like monuments to geological time, their peaks sharp against a sky so blue it seemed artificial, and I understood why people moved to places like this despite the isolation and the economic challenges, why they chose beauty over convenience and space over community. We were perhaps an hour outside of our destination when Jameson suggested a detour, pointing to a highway sign that indicated a scenic route through country we had explored together during a camping trip the summer after our senior year. The lake where we had spent 3 days pretending to fish while actually talking about our fears regarding college and adulthood and the various ways our lives might diverge in the years ahead. The road to the lake was smaller than I remembered, more winding, cutting through stands of aspen that had turned gold with the season and created a canopy above us that filtered the afternoon light into something that seemed to belong in a cathedral rather than a national forest. When we finally reached the water, it was smaller than my memory had preserved it, though no less beautiful, a perfect circle of blue surrounded by mountains that rose so steeply they seemed to be leaning over the water like protective parents. We parked in the same spot we had claimed 20 years earlier, a small clearing that provided access to a rocky beach where we had spent hours skipping stones and arguing about which colleges would offer us the best combination of academic rigor and social freedom. The silence here was different from the silence in the truck, filled with the sound of water lapping against shore and wind moving through trees and the distant call of birds whose names I had never learned. Jameson found a handful of flat stones and began skipping them across the water with the same casual expertise he had displayed as a teenager, each stone dancing across the surface 4 or 5 times before finally surrendering to gravity. I tried to match his technique, but managed only 2 skips before my stones sank with the kind of graceless determination that had characterized most of my athletic endeavors during high school. We walked along the shore for perhaps half an hour, not talking much, but existing together in the landscape in a way that felt both nostalgic and immediate. At one point, he stopped and pointed to a fallen log that extended into the water, the same log where we had sat during that camping trip to discuss our theories about what adult life would require of us. We had been so certain then that we could plan our futures with the same precision we brought to planning our weekend activities, that the world would arrange itself according to our carefully constructed expectations. Sitting on that log again, our feet dangling in water that was shockingly cold despite the warmth of the afternoon sun, I found myself remembering conversations we had had about the kind of men we wanted to become, the careers we would pursue, the families we would build, the ways we would remain friends despite whatever distances and obligations adulthood might place between us. We had been so naive about the complexity of desire, about the way wanting something and being capable of sustaining it were entirely different categories of human experience. The drive from the lake to our final destination took us through landscape that grew increasingly familiar as we approached the town where we had both learned to drive and had our first jobs and kissed our first girlfriends behind the movie theater on Friday nights when our parents thought we were studying at each other's houses. The mountains were the same ones we had looked at every day during high school, though they seemed smaller now, less imposing, as if my perspective had been adjusted by 20 years of living in places where the horizon extended farther than the next ridge. We checked into the Mountain View Inn, a modest establishment that had probably been adequate when it was built in the 1960s and had been maintained just well enough to remain functional without achieving anything approaching elegance. Our room was on the 2nd floor, accessed by an external staircase that creaked under our weight, and equipped with 2 double beds separated by a nightstand that held a lamp with a shade that had clearly seen better decades. The familiarity of sharing a room with Jameson was both comforting and unsettling, a return to the easy intimacy we had shared during countless sleepovers and camping trips, but complicated now by the weight of everything we had not said to each other during the intervening years. We moved around each other with the careful choreography of people who understood the dimensions of the space they were sharing, unpacking our bags and claiming our respective territories with a minimum of discussion. That evening, we walked through the downtown area that had been the center of our teenage universe, noting which businesses had survived the 20 years since we had graduated and which had been replaced by enterprises that suggested either economic vitality or desperation, depending on your perspective. The movie theater was still there, though it was showing films I had never heard of rather than the big-budget productions that had dominated our weekend planning during high school. The diner where we had consumed countless burgers and milkshakes while discussing homework and girls and our theories about what constituted a meaningful life had been converted into a coffee shop that served espresso drinks with names that would have seemed exotic to our 17-year-old selves. We bought beer at the same liquor store where we had once convinced Jameson's older brother to purchase alcohol for a party that had seemed impossibly sophisticated at the time, but which I now recognized as a gathering of teenagers who had no idea what they were doing, but were determined to do it with enthusiasm. The clerk was perhaps 25, young enough that our presence did not register as anything more significant than 2 more customers purchasing alcohol for whatever purposes middle-aged men pursued on Friday evenings in small mountain towns. Back in our hotel room, we sat on our respective beds and drank beer from bottles that seemed smaller than they had when we were teenagers, when a six-pack had felt like sufficient fuel for an entire evening of profound conversation and increasingly elaborate plans for our futures. The television was tuned to a cable news program that was covering some political controversy that would probably be forgotten by the time we returned to our regular lives, but neither of us was paying much attention to the screen. Instead, we talked about the strangeness of returning to a place that had remained essentially unchanged while we had spent 20 years becoming different people. Jameson mentioned that he had driven past his childhood home earlier in the week and had been surprised by how small it looked, how the yard that had seemed vast when he was 10 could now be crossed in a dozen strides. I admitted that I had been avoiding certain neighborhoods entirely, unwilling to confront the possibility that the places where I had learned to be myself might have been altered or demolished in ways that would require me to reconstruct my memories. The conversation drifted from the town to the reunion that would take place the following evening, speculation about which classmates would attend and how they might have changed, and whether the social dynamics that had characterized our high school experience would reassert themselves despite the intervening decades. We discussed people we had not thought about in years, trying to remember their names and the details of their teenage personalities, wondering what had become of the girl who had always worn black lipstick or the boy who had been rumored to be writing a novel that he would never let anyone read. As the evening progressed and the beer loosened our usual caution about emotional revelation, Jameson began talking about his marriage to Vanessa with a candor that surprised me. He described the gradual recognition that they had been trying to build a life together without ever establishing what they each wanted that life to contain, how they had moved through the milestones of adult partnership, engagement, wedding, house purchase, children, without ever addressing the fundamental question of whether they were capable of making each other happy in any sustainable way. "Sometimes I think I married her just to prove something," he said, his voice quiet in the way that suggested he was articulating something he had not previously spoken aloud. He was lying on his back on his bed, staring at the ceiling, and I could hear the weight of years of careful self-examination in those words. I asked what he thought he had been trying to prove, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "To myself, maybe," he said after a pause that seemed to contain entire conversations we had never had. "To prove that I could be the kind of person who builds a normal life with a nice woman and raises children and coaches Little League and shows up to parent-teacher conferences and all the other things that people do when they decide to be adults." The silence that followed felt heavy with implication, and I found myself thinking about my own marriage to Elaine, about the ways I had used our relationship as evidence that I was capable of conventional happiness, that whatever complications I carried regarding desire and identity could be managed through the application of sufficient effort and good intentions. We finished our beer and prepared for sleep with the awkward efficiency that characterizes shared hotel rooms, taking turns in the bathroom and adjusting the thermostat and negotiating who would be responsible for turning off the lights. But even after the room was dark and we were lying in our separate beds listening to the sounds of the hotel settling around us and the occasional car passing on the street below, neither of us seemed to be sleeping. The air between our beds hummed with the kind of tension that makes ordinary silence feel electric, and I found myself acutely aware of the sound of his breathing, the way he shifted position periodically as if he were having difficulty finding a comfortable arrangement of his body against the sheets. I stared at the ceiling and tried to focus on the plans for the following day, the reunion dinner and the conversations with classmates, and all the social navigation that would be required, but my attention kept returning to the presence of the person lying 6 feet away from me in the darkness. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I remember dreaming about the high school locker room, the humid space where we had changed clothes before and after gym class, and where I had learned to be careful about where I let my eyes linger. In the dream, I was 17 again, sitting on the wooden bench that ran between the rows of lockers, watching Jameson pull his t-shirt over his head with the unself-conscious ease that had characterized his relationship with his own body during those years when we were all learning what it meant to inhabit adult forms. Even in the dream, I felt the familiar combination of desire and self-hatred that had characterized so many moments during high school, The way wanting him had felt like evidence of some fundamental defect in my character, some failure to develop properly into the kind of person I was supposed to become. I had spent so much energy during those years trying to redirect my attention toward appropriate objects, girls who smiled at me in the hallway, teachers who praised my essays, activities that would demonstrate my normal participation in the social structures that govern teenage life. I woke before dawn with my heart racing and my shirt damp with sweat, the dream clinging to my consciousness with the persistence of experiences that feel more real than actual memory. The room was still dark, but I could see the faint outline of Jameson's form in the other bed, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing that suggested he was still asleep. I got up quietly and made my way to the bathroom, closing the door before turning on the light and confronting my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked older than I expected, marked by the kind of fatigue that comes from spending too much time thinking about things you cannot change, and I realized that the careful distance I had maintained from my own desires for so many years had not eliminated them, but had simply forced them underground, where they had continued to grow in the darkness like some persistent, unwanted vegetation. I brushed my teeth and washed my face and tried to compose my expression into something that would not reveal the intensity of what I had been feeling, but when I looked at myself again in the mirror, I could see that something fundamental had shifted during the night. The person looking back at me was someone who had spent 40 years learning to be careful about wanting, but who was no longer entirely sure that caution was serving any useful purpose. I whispered to my reflection, testing the words that had been forming in my consciousness like some long-delayed acknowledgement of a truth I had been carrying since I was old enough to understand what desire meant. I wanted you, I said to the face in the mirror, my voice so quiet that it was barely audible even to myself. I still do. The admission hung in the air of that small hotel bathroom like a confession that had been waiting decades to be spoken, and I understood that something irreversible had occurred during the night, some crossing of a line that I had spent so many years carefully maintaining. The reunion dinner was still hours away, but I realized that the real reunion, the one between myself and the parts of my identity I had been keeping in exile, had already begun. When I returned to the room, Jameson was sitting up in his bed, his hair disheveled from sleep, looking at me with an expression that suggested he had been awake longer than I had realized. Neither of us spoke, but there was something in the quality of his attention that made me wonder what he had heard, what he might have understood about the conversation I had been having with myself in the bathroom mirror. The morning light was beginning to filter through the heavy curtains, painting the room in shades of gray and gold that seemed to promise that this day would be different from the ones that had preceded it, that the careful structures we had built to contain our feelings for each other might not be as solid as we had convinced ourselves they were. The reunion dinner was held in the banquet room of the same hotel where we were staying, a space that had probably seemed elegant when it was decorated in the early 1980s, but now felt like a time capsule, all burgundy carpet and brass fixtures and wallpaper that featured a pattern of interconnected diamonds in shades of gold and cream. Round tables covered in white tablecloths filled the room, each one surrounded by 8 chairs, and topped with centerpieces that consisted of artificial flowers arranged in glass bowls that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead in ways that suggested someone had tried very hard to create an atmosphere of celebration on a limited budget. I stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, overwhelmed by the sensation of stepping backward through time into a version of myself that I had not inhabited in decades. The people filling the room looked like slightly blurred copies of the teenagers I remembered, their faces marked by the accumulated evidence of 20 years of living, but still recognizable as the boys and girls who had sat in chemistry class and argued about prom themes and believed that graduation represented the beginning of their real lives rather than simply another transition in a series of transitions that would continue until they were too old to remember what they had once thought adulthood would feel like. Jameson appeared beside me, wearing a dark blue shirt that I had watched him iron carefully in our hotel room, his hair combed in a way that suggested he had spent more time in front of the bathroom mirror than he typically would for any social gathering. He looked nervous in a way that surprised me, his hands moving restlessly as he surveyed the crowd, and I realized that returning to this place required a kind of courage from both of us that had nothing to do with the practical challenges of small talk and renewed acquaintances. We collected name tags from a table near the entrance, adhesive rectangles that featured our senior yearbook photos alongside our names printed in a font that was probably meant to suggest elegance, but actually looked like something that might be used for wedding invitations or funeral programs. My yearbook photo showed a boy with hair that was longer than I had worn it since college, and an expression that suggested he was trying very hard to appear confident about a future he could not actually imagine. Jameson's photo captured that crooked smile I knew so well, though in the artificial lighting of the photography studio, it looked more like a grimace than an expression of genuine happiness. The first hour passed in a blur of conversations that felt both familiar and strange, encounters with people whose names I remembered, but whose adult selves seemed only loosely connected to the teenagers they had been. Sarah Martinez, who had been student body president and was now apparently a real estate agent in Denver, approached us with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she had been practicing her reunion small talk for weeks. She asked about our careers and our families, and whether we still kept in touch with anyone from the old crowd. Questions that required us to provide abbreviated versions of our life stories that emphasized accomplishments, while carefully omitting the more complicated truths about disappointment and compromise and the various ways that adult life had turned out to be different from what any of us had expected. Throughout these conversations, I found myself acutely aware of Jameson's presence beside me, the way he stood slightly closer than casual friendship would typically require. The way his attention seemed to return to me even when he was engaged in discussion with other people. We moved through the room together like binary stars, orbiting each other with a gravitational pull that I hoped was not obvious to our former classmates, but which felt almost overwhelming to me. At one point, we found ourselves talking to Mike Hendricks, who had played football during high school and now owned a sporting goods store in town. He was perhaps 30 pounds heavier than he had been as a teenager, though he carried the weight with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the social hierarchy. And he regaled us with stories about his business and his family and his theories about how the town had changed since we had all left for college. When Mike asked Jameson about his personal life, mentioning that he had heard through the reunion committee that Jameson had gotten married, there was a pause that lasted just long enough to feel significant. Jameson looked down at his beer, then back up at Mike with an expression that was difficult to read. "She always knew I was only half there," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of resignation that seemed to contain entire conversations about failed expectations and mutual disappointments. "The marriage ended last year." Mike made the appropriate sympathetic noises, but I could see that he was already looking around the room for someone else to talk to. Someone whose personal revelations would not require him to navigate the emotional complexity that Jameson's admission had introduced into what was supposed to be a light conversation about catching up with old friends. After Mike moved on to terrorize some other group with his stories about high school football glory, Jameson and I found ourselves standing near the windows that looked out over the parking lot where we had learned to drive during driver's education class, taking turns behind the wheel of a car that belonged to the school district and trying to master the complex coordination required to operate a vehicle without embarrassing ourselves in front of our classmates. The view outside was exactly as I remembered it, though the mountains in the distance seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than they had appeared when we were 17 and believed that the landscape of our childhood would always define the boundaries of our world. The parking lot was full of cars that were newer and more expensive than anything we could have afforded as teenagers, evidence that most of our classmates had achieved the kind of economic stability that had seemed like an impossible dream when we were worried about affording gas money and movie tickets. We talked to Jennifer Walsh, who had been valedictorian and was now a pediatrician in Boulder, and to David Kim, who had played in the jazz band and was working as a software engineer in Seattle, and to a succession of other people whose adult accomplishments seemed to validate the predictions that guidance counselors and teachers had made about their potential during senior year. Everyone asked the same questions and provided the same abbreviated summaries of their post-graduation experiences, conversations that felt like performance pieces designed to demonstrate that we had all successfully transitioned from teenagers with potential into adults with actual achievements. But beneath the surface of these cheerful exchanges, I could feel something else happening, a recognition that the social dynamics that had governed our relationships during high school were still present, though muted by the passage of time and the acquired social skills that came with 2 decades of navigating adult responsibilities. The popular kids were still popular, though their status was now measured in terms of career success and family stability rather than athletic ability or party invitations. The quiet kids were still quiet, though some of them had found ways to transform their introversion into professional advantages in fields that rewarded careful observation and independent thinking. As the evening progressed, and the alcohol began to affect the collective inhibitions of the group, the conversations became more honest, more willing to acknowledge the gap between the dreams we had harbored as teenagers and the realities we had constructed as adults. People began admitting to divorces and career changes and the various compromises that had been required to navigate the transition from the optimism of 18 to the pragmatism of 38. Jameson and I found ourselves at a table with several people we had known well during high school, including Amy Patterson, who had been Jameson's girlfriend for most of senior year and who was now married to someone she had met in law school and living in Phoenix with 2 children and a practice that specialized in family law. She looked essentially the same as she had 20 years earlier, though there was something in her eyes that suggested the intervening decades had taught her things about human nature that she might have preferred not to learn. When she asked Jameson about his children, her voice carried a warmth that suggested genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and I watched him describe Emma and Jake with the same careful tenderness he had shown when talking about them during our drive. Amy listened with the attention of someone who understood the particular challenges of maintaining connection with children across the emotional distance created by divorce, and I realized that she was probably navigating similar complexities in her own life, though she was too discreet to offer details about her personal struggles to a room full of people she had not seen in 20 years. The conversation at our table drifted from children to careers to the various ways that the town had changed since we had graduated, but I found it difficult to focus on the details because I was becoming increasingly aware of the way Jameson's knee was almost touching mine under the table. The way his hand rested on the white tablecloth in a position that would have made it easy for me to reach out and cover it with my own if I had been brave enough to make such a gesture in a room full of people who had known us when we were boys and might draw conclusions about what such contact would mean. As the official program wound down and people began to cluster in smaller groups or drift toward the bar that had been set up in one corner of the room, Jameson and I found ourselves talking to fewer people, standing closer together, existing in a bubble of increasing intimacy that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The alcohol had softened the edges of our usual caution, and I could see in his face the same recognition that was probably visible in mine. The understanding that something fundamental was shifting between us that could not be undone by returning to our separate lives and pretending that this evening had been simply about nostalgia and renewed friendship. By 10 o'clock, most of our classmates were beginning to make their excuses and head home to hotel rooms or the houses where they had grown up and which they were visiting for the first time in years. We said our goodbyes with promises to stay in touch that we probably both knew we would not keep, exchanged business cards and email addresses that would likely be forgotten by the time we returned to our regular routines, hugged people we had not thought about since graduation and would probably not think about again until the next reunion in another 10 years. The elevator ride to our floor passed in silence that felt charged with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. We stood on opposite sides of the small car, not looking at each other directly but aware of each other in a way that made the space feel simultaneously too large and too small. When the doors opened on our floor, we walked down the hallway toward our room with the measured pace of people who understood that whatever was about to happen would determine the shape of our relationship for whatever time remained to us. Inside the room, I sat on the edge of my bed and began to remove my shoes, the ordinary gesture feeling weighted with significance in a way that suggested we had crossed some invisible threshold between public and private selves. The room was exactly as we had left it that morning, two beds separated by a nightstand, a window that looked out over the parking lot, a bathroom with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly ill, but somehow it felt like an entirely different space than the one we had occupied the night before. I was reaching for the buttons of my shirt when Jameson spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying an intensity that made me freeze in the middle of the gesture. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question hung in the air between us like something that had weight and substance, and I found myself unable to move, my hand still positioned at the second button of my shirt, my heart suddenly beating fast enough that I wondered if he could hear it across the 6 feet of space that separated us. "Tell you what," I managed to say, though we both knew exactly what he was asking about, had probably both known for 20 years what conversation we were finally going to have. He was looking at me directly now, no longer bothering to maintain the careful distance that had characterized our interactions since we were teenagers. His eyes were dark in the lamplight, serious in a way that reminded me of the boy he had been when he was trying to work through some complex problem in calculus or philosophy class, when he would focus all his attention on understanding something that seemed just beyond his reach. "That you were in love with me," he said, and the words seemed to echo in the small room like a confession that had been waiting decades to be spoken aloud. I could have denied it, should have denied it, could have laughed and suggested that he had misunderstood the nature of our friendship, that the intensity of our connection during high school had been the result of shared interests and complementary personalities rather than anything that could be characterized as romantic love. Instead, I found myself nodding, barely, the gesture so small that someone who was not watching carefully might have missed it entirely. "Because I didn't think you could carry it," I said, my voice hoarse with the effort of speaking truths that I had been keeping carefully contained for so long. Not back then. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. I could hear the air conditioning unit cycling on, the sound of someone walking down the hallway outside our door, the distant hum of traffic from the street below, but mostly I was aware of the sound of my own breathing and his, the way we seemed to be existing in a bubble of suspended time where anything might be possible. He stood up from his bed and crossed the space between us slowly, deliberately, like someone who was trying to be careful not to startle a wild animal. When he reached the place where I was sitting, he stopped and looked down at me for a moment that felt like a question being asked and answered simultaneously. "And now?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, I reached up and placed my hand against his chest, feeling the warmth of his body through the fabric of his shirt, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under my palm. He covered my hand with his own, and for a moment we simply stood there like that, connected by touch that was both more and less than we had ever allowed ourselves before. When he leaned down to kiss me, it was not with the urgency that I might have expected after 20 years of wanting and careful distance. Instead, it was quiet, careful, like we were both terrified of breaking something that had taken decades to understand and might never be repaired if we moved too quickly or demanded too much from the moment. His lips were warm and slightly chapped from the mountain air, and he tasted like the beer we had been drinking and something else that was entirely him. Familiar in a way that suggested my body had been remembering this possibility even when my conscious mind had been working to forget it. When we finally separated, it was only by a few inches, and I could feel his breath against my face as we looked at each other with an intensity that seemed to contain entire conversations about desire and fear and the various ways that love could be both salvation and destruction. "I love you," he said, the words simple and direct in a way that made them seem simultaneously inevitable and miraculous. "I think I always have." The admission hung between us like something fragile and precious, and I understood that we had finally arrived at the place we had been circling around since we were 17 years old and too afraid of ourselves to acknowledge what we felt. All those years of careful friendship and measured distance, and the elaborate structures we had built to contain our feelings had led us to this moment in a generic hotel room, where we could finally stop pretending that what existed between us was anything as simple as friendship. I kissed him again, this time with more certainty, and felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of my understanding about who I was and what I was capable of wanting. For 20 years, I had been living a life that was constructed around the careful management of desire, the patient cultivation of appropriate feelings, and the systematic suppression of everything that seemed too dangerous to acknowledge. But sitting there in that hotel room with Jameson's hands in my hair and his mouth against mine, I realized that all that careful control had been nothing more than an elaborate form of self-denial that had cost me more than I had ever been willing to calculate. When we finally lay down together on the bed that had seemed impossibly narrow when I was sitting on it alone, I felt like I was coming home to a version of myself that I had been keeping in exile for most of my adult life. The complicated choreography of removing clothes and rearranging ourselves against the sheets felt both foreign and familiar, like we were remembering how to do something we had always known how to do but had never allowed ourselves to practice. And later, when we were lying in the darkness listening to each other breathe and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred between us, I understood that something irreversible had happened, some crossing of a boundary that would make it impossible to return to the careful distance we had maintained for so long. We had finally stopped running from the truth of what we meant to each other, and whatever came next would have to be built on the foundation of that acknowledgement, no matter how complicated or difficult or beautiful it might turn out to be. I woke to the sound of water running in the bathroom and the gradual recognition that something fundamental had changed in the architecture of my life. The hotel room was filled with the gray light that precedes dawn, that liminal hour when the world exists in a state of suspension between night and day, and I could feel the weight of Jameson's absence from the bed even before I turned to confirm that he was no longer lying beside me. The sheets still held the warmth of his body and the faint scent of his skin, evidence of the intimacy we had shared that now seemed both more real and less real than anything I had experienced in decades. I lay there for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred between us, the way 20 years of careful distance had collapsed in the space of a few hours, leaving us both exposed in ways that I was not sure either of us was prepared to handle. When Jameson emerged from the bathroom, he was already dressed in the jeans and t-shirt he had worn the day before, his hair damp from the shower, his movements efficient and purposeful in a way that suggested he was trying very hard not to think about what he was doing. He did not look at me as he gathered his few belongings and placed them in his overnight bag with the kind of methodical attention that people usually reserve for tasks that require concentration to avoid thinking about other things. I sat up in bed, suddenly aware of my nakedness in a way that had not occurred to me the night before, and reached for the sheet to cover myself. The gesture felt absurd given what we had shared, but there was something in the quality of his movement that suggested the easy intimacy of a few hours earlier had been replaced by something more complicated, more fraught with the kind of anxiety that makes ordinary human interaction feel like navigation through a minefield. "We said we wouldn't talk about it," he said finally, his voice flat in a way that reminded me of the careful neutrality he had used during high school when discussing topics that made him uncomfortable. His back was still turned to me as he folded his clothes with unnecessary precision, as if the proper arrangement of fabric might somehow restore the order that had been disrupted by the choices we had made in the darkness. The words hit me like cold water, a reminder that the promises we had made as frightened teenagers might still have power over the men we had become, despite everything that had changed between then and now. I felt something clench in my chest, a familiar sensation that I recognized as the return of the careful distance I had spent so many years perfecting, the automatic response of protection against the possibility of rejection or abandonment. "You promised," he continued, finally turning to face me though his eyes remained focused somewhere over my left shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly. "You said we'd never talk about it. You promised me." I could hear the echo of our 17-year-old selves in those words, the memory of that afternoon in his basement when we had almost kissed and then pulled away from each other with the kind of terror that comes from recognizing that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. We had been so young then, so certain that we could control our feelings through the application of sufficient willpower and good intentions, that we could preserve our friendship by simply agreeing not to acknowledge what existed between us. But I was no longer 17, and the man sitting on the edge of the other bed was no longer the boy who had been afraid of his own father discovering what we meant to each other. The promises we had made in fear were different from the ones we might choose to make in love, and I found myself unwilling to honor agreements that had been designed to protect us from possibilities that no longer seemed like dangers. You said if I tried anything, you'd leave, I said, my voice hoarse from sleep and the effort of speaking truths that felt dangerous even now. But you were the one who kissed me. You were the one who asked why I never told you. The words seemed to hit him like physical blows, and I watched his shoulders tense as if he were bracing himself against impact. He turned away from me again, his hands moving restlessly as he searched for something else to organize, some task that would allow him to avoid the conversation we were having. I don't know what that was, he said, and his voice cracked on the words like he was 17 again and afraid of being caught wanting something he was not supposed to want. I don't know why I said those things. But he did know. We both knew. The careful choreography of avoidance that followed was a performance designed to protect us both from having to acknowledge what we had already acknowledged, to unsay what had already been said, to return to a place of safety that no longer existed because we had finally told each other the truth. The drive back to Portland stretched ahead of us like a sentence we both had to serve, 2,000 miles of highway that would take us away from the place where we had finally stopped pretending and back to the lives we had constructed around the careful management of desire. We packed our bags in silence, checked out of the hotel with the kind of polite efficiency that characterized strangers, and loaded the truck with movements that were careful not to result in accidental contact. For the first several hours, neither of us spoke except to negotiate the practical requirements of travel, which route to take, where to stop for gas, whether the radio was too loud or too quiet. The landscape outside the windows was the same one we had driven through on our way to Colorado, but everything looked different now, flatter somehow, less filled with possibility, as if the promise of return had leached the color from the mountains and sky. I found myself staring out the passenger window at the passing scenery and thinking about the different kinds of silence that exist between people. There was the comfortable silence of old friendship, the charged silence of mutual recognition, and this new kind of silence that felt like a wall being constructed brick by brick with each mile we traveled away from the place where we had finally told each other what we felt. Jameson drove with the kind of concentration that suggested he was using the task of navigation as a way to avoid thinking about anything else, his hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than the road conditions required, his jaw tight in the way that indicated he was fighting some internal battle that he was not willing to discuss. When I tried to make conversation about neutral topics, the weather, the scenery, the logistics of our return, his responses were brief and carefully devoid of the warmth that had characterized our interactions during the drive east. By the time we stopped for lunch at a truck stop diner outside Elko, Nevada, the silence between us had become so dense that it felt like another passenger in the cab of the truck, something that took up space and required accommodation. The diner was the kind of place where long-haul truckers and families on vacation came to consume calories and caffeine before returning to the highway. All vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that had been sitting on the burner long enough to develop the kind of bitterness that matched my mood. We sat across from each other in a booth near the window, the same configuration we had chosen during our trip east, but everything about the geometry of our relationship had changed. Where before we had leaned toward each other, drawn by the gravitational pull of renewed friendship and unacknowledged attraction, now we sat back against our respective seats, creating as much distance as the small space would allow. I ordered coffee and a sandwich I did not want, more for the purpose of having something to do with my hands than because I was hungry. Jameson stared at his menu with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to decode some complex mathematical equation rather than simply choosing between a cheeseburger and a turkey club. When the waitress came to take our order, we spoke to her rather than to each other, as if she were a translator facilitating communication between two people who no longer shared a common language. It was only after she had brought our food, and we had spent several minutes engaging in the elaborate pretense of eating, that Jameson finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that I had to lean forward to hear him over the sound of other conversations and the clatter of dishes being cleared from nearby tables. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his eyes focused on his coffee cup rather than on my face. "But I don't know how to be what you want." The words carried the weight of 20 years of careful navigation, of friendship maintained across distance and time, and the accumulated evidence that we meant something to each other that could not be easily categorized or explained. I could hear the fear in his voice, the same terror that had characterized our interactions as teenagers, when we were both beginning to understand that the feelings we had for each other were more complicated than anything we had been taught to recognize or accept. "I never asked you to be anything but honest," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I never asked you to change or to become someone different. I just asked you to stop pretending that what happened between us didn't mean anything." He looked up at me then, and I could see in his face the same confusion and longing that had been there when we were 17 and trying to figure out how to want each other without destroying everything we had built together. But there was something else there too, something that looked like resignation, as if he had already decided that the cost of honesty was higher than he was willing to pay. We finished our meal in silence, paid the check, and returned to the truck for the final leg of our journey. The afternoon sun was harsh and direct, creating shadows that seemed darker and more defined than they had during the morning, and I found myself thinking about the way that some experiences could only be fully understood in retrospect, when you had enough distance to see the shape of what had actually occurred. The last few hours of the drive passed like a meditation on endings, each mile marker a small countdown to the moment when we would have to say goodbye and return to our separate lives with whatever understanding we had gained about ourselves and each other. I watched the landscape change from desert to farmland to the green hills that marked our approach to Portland, and I felt something settling in my chest that was not quite peace, but was perhaps the beginning of acceptance. When we finally reached my house, Jameson helped me carry my bag to the front door with the kind of careful politeness that characterized interactions between people who were trying not to hurt each other's feelings while simultaneously creating distance. We stood on my front walk for a moment, two men in their late 30s who had spent the weekend discovering that the careful structures they had built to contain their feelings were not as solid as they had believed. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final declaration of love or regret or promise to stay in touch. Instead, he simply looked at me for a moment with an expression that seemed to contain everything we had said and everything we had not said, then turned and walked back to his truck with the measured pace of someone who was trying very hard not to run. I stood in my doorway and watched him drive away, the blue Ford disappearing around the corner and taking with it the possibility of whatever we might have been to each other if we had been braver or different or living in a world that made space for the kind of love we had finally acknowledged. The sound of his engine faded until it was indistinguishable from the general noise of the neighborhood, and I was left standing there with my overnight bag and the understanding that some things, once spoken, could not be unspoken, even when all parties involved wished they could return to the safety of silence. Inside my house, everything was exactly as I had left it 3 days earlier, but somehow it all looked different now, smaller and more contained, as if my perspective had been adjusted by the weekend's events in ways that would take time to fully understand. I unpacked my bag and put my clothes in the hamper and tried to return to the routines that had sustained me for so many years, but I could feel the presence of what had occurred like a new piece of furniture that had been added to my life, something I would have to learn to navigate around. There was no promise of more contact, no plan for future meetings, no discussion of what the weekend had meant or how it might change the carefully constructed distance we had maintained for so long. There was only the knowing, the understanding that we had finally told each other the truth about what we felt, and that the truth was both more and less than either of us had been prepared to handle. That night, as I lay in my own bed surrounded by the familiar sounds of my neighborhood and the books that had been my companions for so many years, I found myself thinking about the different kinds of love that exist in the world. There was the love that demanded everything, that insisted on reshaping lives and relationships to accommodate its intensity. And there was the love that existed quietly, that asked for nothing more than acknowledgement, that could be carried like a secret treasure that enriched the carrier without requiring anything from the beloved. I thought about Jameson driving through the darkness toward whatever life he would build from the pieces of what had been broken during our weekend together, and I realized that loving him did not require him to love me back in the same way, did not require him to be braver than he was capable of being or to want more than he was able to accept. It only required me to be honest about what I felt, to stop hiding from the truth of my own heart, to live with the knowledge that some kinds of love were their own reward, regardless of whether they were returned or reciprocated or acknowledged by anyone other than the person doing the loving. The weekend had changed everything and nothing. I was still a high school English teacher living alone in a craftsman house in Portland, still someone who graded papers and tended a garden and watched foreign films on Friday nights. But I was also someone who had finally stopped lying to himself about who he was and what he wanted, and that honesty, difficult as it was to carry, felt like a kind of freedom that I had not experienced since I was young enough to believe that wanting something and being able to have it were the same thing. The knowing was enough. It had to be enough. And perhaps, in time, it would be. The weeks that followed our return passed with the measured rhythm of a life being carefully reconstructed, each day adding another layer to the foundation of whatever version of myself I was learning to inhabit. I returned to my classroom on Monday morning and taught Gatsby with a clarity that surprised my students, discussing the nature of longing and the difference between wanting something and understanding what that wanting meant with an authority that came from recent experience rather than academic theory. My colleagues noticed something different about me, though they could not have articulated what had changed. Mrs. Rodriguez, who taught in the classroom next to mine, mentioned that I seemed more present somehow, more willing to engage in the small conversations that filled the spaces between classes. I had not realized until she said it that I had been living at a slight remove from my own life for so many years, participating in the rituals of daily existence while maintaining a careful distance from anything that might require too much emotional investment. But something fundamental had shifted during that weekend in Colorado, some recognition that honesty, even when it was painful, was preferable to the elaborate structures of denial I had spent decades perfecting. I still lived alone in my craftsman house, still graded papers at the kitchen table, and tended my garden with the same patient attention I had always brought to growing things. But the solitude felt different now, chosen rather than imposed, a space I inhabited by preference rather than by default. The house itself seemed to welcome this change, as if the walls had been holding their breath for 20 years and could finally exhale. I found myself rearranging furniture not because I was dissatisfied with the previous arrangement, but because I wanted to create spaces that reflected the person I was becoming rather than the one I had been. I moved my reading chair closer to the window, where the light was better and I could see the garden while I worked through the novels I assigned to my students. November gave way to December, and with it the seasonal rituals that had always marked the passage of time in my carefully ordered life. I put up a small Christmas tree, not because I expected visitors, but because the act of decoration felt like a celebration of something I could not quite name. I bought gifts for Mrs. Chun and for the few colleagues I considered friends, wrapped them in paper that was more expensive than necessary, and found genuine pleasure in the thought of their surprise at receiving something chosen with care rather than obligation. I continued to think about Jameson, though not with the obsessive intensity that had characterized my thoughts about him during high school. Instead, he existed in my consciousness the way certain pieces of music do, present as background accompaniment to whatever else I was doing, adding depth and texture to experiences that might otherwise have felt flat. I wondered how he was navigating the return to his life in Denver, whether the weekend had affected him with the same sense of fundamental shift that I was experiencing, whether he was learning to live with the knowledge of what we had finally said to each other. There were moments when I considered calling him, times when I would find myself holding my phone and scrolling to his number before remembering that the conversation we needed to have might not be one that could occur over distance, that some kinds of understanding required physical presence and the patience to sit with silence until it revealed its meaning. Instead, I sent him a Christmas card, nothing more elaborate than a simple image of winter trees and a message that I hoped he and his children were well. I did not expect a response, and when none came, I felt neither disappointed nor surprised. The winter months passed with their characteristic combination of isolation and introspection, the gray Pacific Northwest sky creating a dome of contemplation that seemed to encourage long thoughts and careful consideration of life's more complex questions. I read more than usual, working my way through novels I had been meaning to get to for years, finding in the works of writers who understood loneliness and desire a reflection of my own recent experiences. I was particularly drawn to authors who wrote about the space between wanting something and having it, who understood that the most profound emotions often existed in the gap between recognition and fulfillment. I assigned Camus to my advanced placement students and watched them struggle with the notion that meaning could be found in the struggle itself rather than in the achievement of specific goals, that authenticity might require accepting the limitations of what was possible rather than demanding that the world conform to our desires. Spring arrived early that year, with daffodils pushing through the soil in my garden weeks before I expected them, and the cherry tree outside my kitchen window beginning to show the first hints of the blossoms that would transform it from skeleton to celebration in the span of a few weeks. I found myself spending more time outdoors, not because the weather was particularly inviting, but because something about the process of renewal happening around me seemed to mirror whatever was occurring in my own emotional landscape. It was on a Tuesday in late March, as I was preparing dinner and listening to the news on the radio, that I heard the mail truck stop outside my house with its characteristic squeal of brakes and rattle of metal doors. I had learned to time my day around these small interruptions, the delivery of mail that was mostly bills and advertisements, but occasionally contained something that reminded me that I existed in connection with other people, even when that connection was as minimal as a catalog or a notice from the city about changes to the garbage collection schedule. I waited until I had finished chopping vegetables for the stir-fry I was making before walking to the front door and retrieving the day's delivery from the metal box that was mounted beside my front steps. The usual assortment of utility bills and promotional materials, a notice from the school district about changes to the health insurance plan, and a single envelope that made me stop moving entirely because there was no return address, but the handwriting was immediately recognizable despite the years that had passed since I had seen it regularly. I stood on my front porch holding the envelope, feeling my heart rate increase in a way that reminded me of the physical symptoms of anxiety I had experienced as a teenager when faced with situations that seemed to require more courage than I possessed. The envelope was standard white paper, my name and address written in the careful script that Jameson had perfected during high school, when he was taking calligraphy as an elective and spending hours practicing the formation of letters until they looked like small works of art. Inside the house, I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and finished preparing dinner with the kind of methodical attention that people bring to tasks when they are trying to avoid thinking about something else. I cooked the vegetables until they were exactly the right combination of tender and crisp, seasoned the rice with care, arranged everything on a plate in a way that was more aesthetically pleasing than my usual approach to solitary dining. Only after I had eaten and cleaned the dishes and wiped down the counters did I finally open the envelope, using a knife to slice cleanly along the edge rather than tearing it open in a way that might damage whatever was inside. The letter was written on a single sheet of paper, the same careful handwriting, but fewer words than I might have expected given the months that had passed since we had spoken. The message was simple, direct in a way that reminded me of how he had always communicated when he was trying to be honest about something that scared him. No salutation, no signature, just a few lines that seemed to contain everything we had not been able to say to each other during that difficult drive home from Colorado. I lied, the letter said. I did want you to try something. I always did. I read the words several times, not because they were difficult to understand, but because I wanted to absorb their full meaning, to consider the courage it must have taken to write them and send them across the distance that separated our lives. There was something profound in the simplicity of the admission, the recognition that fear had made liars of us both, that the careful distance we had maintained had been built on the false premise that safety was more valuable than honesty. I folded the letter carefully and carried it to the living room, where my books stood in rows on the built-in shelves that had probably been installed by someone who understood that literature was not decoration but necessity. I found my copy of The Stranger, a paperback edition that I had read so many times the spine was cracked and some of the pages were loose, and placed the letter between the pages where Massault realizes that the universe is indifferent to human desire, but that this indifference is not the same thing as hostility. The placement felt appropriate. Somehow, this letter about the truth of wanting nestled inside a novel about the necessity of accepting what cannot be changed. I left the book on the shelf and walked to the kitchen, where I put water in the kettle and prepared tea with the same careful attention I brought to all the small rituals that structured my days. While the water heated, I stood at the window that looked out over my back garden, watching the light fade from the sky in gradual stages that turned everything from gold to gray to something deeper that was not quite darkness, but was moving in that direction. The cherry tree was in full bloom now, its branches heavy with white flowers that would last only a few weeks before giving way to the green abundance of summer. As I watched, it began to rain, not the heavy downpour that sometimes characterized spring storms in the Pacific Northwest, but the gentle, persistent precipitation that seemed to arrive without announcement and settle in for the duration. The drops struck the window with soft sounds that created a rhythm like breathing, and I found myself thinking about the different kinds of silence that existed in the world, the way that some quiet held space for possibility, while other quiet simply marked the absence of noise. The kettle whistled, and I poured water over the tea leaves I had measured into my favorite cup, a piece of ceramic that had been a gift from a student several years earlier and which had become part of my evening routine. I stood at the window drinking tea and watching the rain transform my garden into something that looked softer, more generous, as if the water were washing away whatever accumulated dust or disappointment had settled on the leaves and flowers during the dry days that had preceded this weather. I did not smile as I stood there, did not feel the kind of dramatic emotional release that might characterize the ending of a different kind of story. Instead, I felt something settle in my chest, some recognition that I had finally arrived at a place where I could exist without apology, where the truth of what I felt was neither burden nor blessing, but simply another fact about the world that required acknowledgement rather than judgment. The letter from Jameson had not changed anything concrete about my circumstances. I was still a man living alone in Portland, still someone who taught high school students about the complexities of human desire through the medium of literature written by people who had understood that wanting and having were different categories of experience. But something fundamental had shifted in my relationship to my own life, some acceptance that honesty was its own reward regardless of what practical outcomes it might or might not generate. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean in preparation for whatever would grow from the soil that was being prepared by this gentle soaking. I finished my tea and rinsed the cup and prepared for bed with the same careful attention I brought to all my evening rituals. But there was something different in the quality of these familiar actions, some sense that I was caring for a version of myself that I had finally learned to value. In bed, surrounded by the sound of rain against the roof and windows, I thought about the letter folded between the pages of The Stranger, about the courage it had taken to write those words, and the different kind of courage it would take to carry them forward into whatever future was being prepared by this acknowledgement of truth. I thought about Jameson, probably lying in his own bed several states away, and wondered if he was experiencing the same sense of something fundamental having been completed, some circle that had finally been closed after 20 years of careful avoidance. The rain fell until morning, and when I woke the garden was transformed, everything greener and more alive, ready for whatever would grow from the soil that had been prepared by the patient work of water and time. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at a world that was essentially the same as it had been the day before, but which seemed somehow more generous, more willing to accommodate the various forms that love might take when it was finally allowed to exist without apology or explanation. The letter was still there between the pages of the novel, and it would remain there, a testament to the possibility that truth, once spoken, could become its own form of sustenance, its own quiet victory over the forces that encouraged people to live smaller lives than their hearts were designed to sustain. The knowing had become sacred, transformed from burden into blessing through the simple act of acknowledgement, and that transformation felt like enough, like more than enough, like everything that had ever been needed.